Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of EOXS's Stories on Steel. This is a steel industry podcast featuring the big names of the business and the advice/stories they've accrued over their years as insiders. Steel has been a vital component in American life for well over a century, and the men and women who've helped it flourish are a diverse group of innovators full of interesting tales. We hope to share some of said tales here with you today. Thanks again to EOXS for providing this platform. In addition to this show, they are bringing businesses online by providing a standardized digital workspace for all your steel-related needs. Today, we welcome to the show Vice President of American Heavy Plates, Damian Brennan. Please enjoy.
So Damian, thank you so much for your time today, joining me here on the show. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you entered the steel industry before we get into the heavier stuff?
Long time ago, I went to a manufacturing high school, of all places, in New York City, Brooklyn Tech High School. And I found that, we were taking engineering and we were taking strength materials and physics. But my favorite classes were actually machine shop, welding. We actually had a small furnace in the school that let us melt aluminum and pour it into our own cast molds. That foundry, unfortunately, has been closed since I went, but they graduate every single student, 1,500 students a year with certification in AutoCAD Inventor. So you're churning out generations of engineers and people who want to be engaged in manufacturing, the sciences, making things in general. It took me a lot of years after that, though, but I ended up serendipitously at a trading company in New York City that was trading steel coils and plate on the international market. Ended up doing that for a while, left, went to grad school, took a turn at consulting, like everyone else, finishing an MBA. And then I ended up back into a different steel trading company, working with heavy steel plate in large quantities. And we rode this pricing in 2005 up until 2008, and then watched that fall off a cliff, and dozens of companies, customers, competitors go bankrupt. And we said, okay, everyone learned their lesson. Everyone will keep inventories within reason going forward. And then we saw 3 years later another giant inventory run up and a fall. Not nearly as bad as 2008, 2009, but pretty bad. And over and over and over again, we'd see this cycle of inventory prices racing up and everyone buying in a panic, and then inventory crashing down to the ground and companies going out of business, lives being ruined. And a lot of our folks came out of the steel plate market, but also coming out of the service center industry. And we had seen just too many companies get torn up, too many people lose their jobs. We saw destroying economic value for investors. So we spoke with some really smart people. As a matter of fact, we heard a guy from MIT who was a supply chain professional to look at this and say, how do you escape this treadmill? How do you get off of this cycle of booms and busts? Can we predict demand better? Can we somehow or another take enough waste out through normal means? And they all looked at it and they all came back and said, there's no mathematical solution to this. There's no AI solution. There's no math that'll get you to a better solution. You just have a really bad model where you're putting orders in for steel plate months and months and months before you need it, before you have any actual demand from your customer. The heavier the plate, the more that's true. And we deal entirely in 3-inch and heavier. But what we did figure out is that you could actually solve the problem if you brought the decision about what you're going to make closer to the actual customer demand. And we said, okay, look, we can't build $1 billion heavy plate mill. There's not enough demand in the U.S. to justify that. But we figured out a plate mill of the right size, with the right equipment, with the right people, where we can make heavy plate 3-inch through 22-inch thick, close enough to the actual demand of customers, and meet their demands better than the old model can, while taking out waste, taking out time, taking out cost, and taking out things like mill minimums. If you want a half a plate, I'll sell you half a plate. And when buyers at service centers hear that for the first time, they're shocked. But for us, it makes all the sense in the world, because our job is to take on the inventory risk that everyone else has, because we've got a better model of doing it. So we created this company. We've been rolling steel since January of this year. We've recruited 194 customers so far. Our sales are growing, granted from zero in January, but they've grown pretty substantially. We're doing about 15 to 20% increase a month. And in fact, we're on target to hit our sales targets for the year, even though we're starting up in COVID-19, which was not on the original business plan.
I think we get to it almost inevitably with every one of these episodes that we do, but I think it's fine tackling it earlier than we otherwise would.
Mhm.
How exactly is American Heavy Plates dealing with new restrictions due to COVID, making sure safety is paramount at different stages of production? Like, what are you guys doing?
Well, we all carry around a very large supply of masks, hand sanitizer by the drum at this stage. But in the early days, it was the most scary time because, frankly, one or two of us actually came down very early with COVID at the beginning of the epidemic here in Eastern Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, right where they come together. But fortunately, we've been able to encourage really strong hand washing, sanitizing of equipment, wearing of masks, wearing PPE. We have a great safety officer on staff who's also a paramedic who's been able to help us through a lot of breaking through some of the resistance that maybe some people had early on about this idea of mask wearing. And so far, fingers crossed, we've been extraordinarily fortunate since then. But really, if it comes down to a single thing, would be communication. Talking at least once a week with every single staff member about the importance of staying healthy for themselves, for their families. The company is sort of down low on the priority list, but if you want to stay healthy, if you want your family to be healthy, if you want to be able to support your family, take care of yourself, take care of the people around you. And if you have any problems at all, if you think you've been exposed, you call us, your pay is taken care of. Don't worry about that. Worry about staying healthy, worry about keeping the spread down, from spreading to anybody else. We'll take care of the money part of it. You just make sure you take care of yourself and your family and people first.
I think that commitment that is apparent to people at every level of production in any steel business. This is still an industry which is very much defined by boots on the ground, people moving massive amounts of weight day in, day out. And I think the level of appreciation you guys seem to be showing for those individuals is very inspiring. Was that ideology present at the beginning of American Heavy Plates, or?
Yeah, it's shown up in a lot of ways. My boss is a former Marine officer from the Vietnam War.
Oh boy.
And at the end of the day, it's about your people. Now, you need discipline. You need people to be responsible. You need them to take responsibility for their choices. But at the end of the day, all you have are your people. We're not a 10,000 person company. There's 65 of us. We know the names of each person that walks through the doors here every day. And chances are we probably know their families because the community around here is very small. It's not a giant booming metropolitan city. So the short answer is yes, that has been showing up in all sorts of ways, including our safety record. And my VP of operations hates when I talk about this, but we've had 0 reportable injuries during the entire construction phase and operations, because if you take that systematic approach of keeping people happy and safe and healthy, that has knockoff effects throughout the entire organization.
Do you think that, well, first of all, as you know, with a brother currently in the United States Marine Corps, and from the stories I've heard from him, asking if being a kind organization at the beginning, I was not expecting you to say, "Oh yeah, we love being nice. My boss is a former Vietnam era Marine officer." That is just about one of the scariest things I could imagine, and I've seen some scary things in my time.
Uh, yeah, you would think that, but at the end of the day, if what's the alternative? I mean, what we're telling everyone is that we're focused on the American market, on American customers, on making American manufacturers stronger for the long term. But if the people who are working at these companies are getting sick, if the people in the communities are being sickened by pollution, if you're driving your suppliers out of business because you're charging, sourcing at the lowest possible price no matter what, if you do these things, what kind of sustainable environment do you create for your company in the long run?
I think that this is a good point to pivot a little bit more to what the steel plate industry is like, just for full transparency, when you were describing the weight of steel plates and you were instead of using traditional metrics, you were measuring it in the thickness of said plate, 2-inch, 3-inch. That was something that makes sense once I heard it, but it probably wouldn't have occurred to me otherwise.
Uh,
Did entering this specific niche of the industry, did you have to pick up on a lot of weird lessons like that? Like, was there a lot of learning on the fly, or did you have time to acclimate a little bit?
we have a pretty strenuous initial on-ramping for staff when they come on board. We cover a whole bunch of things, but there are probably a couple of equations that anyone who's ever worked here is going to remember probably until the last breath of their lives. 0.2836, that's how many pounds per cubic inch steel plate weighs. And how do you calculate theoretical weight of circles and rings and rectangles and odd shapes? So there is a lot of things that have to be learned. And then when you add a mill to it, so we actually have a steel mill and a service center. It's the first time you've got that combination in the United States on the heavy plate side. There's something that all of us had to learn. Some of us are more familiar with, let's say, the steel processing side, less on the mill side. We brought in some great people on the mill side who had to learn about yields on the service center and strategies for being able to deliver customers in very short turnaround times. Fortunately, what we've been able to do is hire a lot of really smart people and some really talented people along the way, both as staff members, but as consultants, as assistants, and coaching, and getting us up and running and being able to take what can sometimes be a 2-year period to fully ramp up a mill, and we've been able to compress that down to a fairly narrow time. And at this point, we've had 2 customer rejections in the course of almost a year. And those are very small rejections, and they bother me that we have the rejections. But 2 rejections in your first year of operating a steel mill and service center is pretty extraordinary.
Well, given our brief pre-podcast conversation all about the writings of one Mr. Brandon Sanderson, I can tell you are a very smart individual indeed.
My mama thinks so.
Oh, well, she raised you right, sir. She definitely raised you right. Are you a native Ohioan?
No, I grew up in Brooklyn.
Really?
Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn, and then Sheepshead Bay, and then eventually Marine Park.
Oh man, my fiance is from Brooklyn.
It's a big place, very popular. A lot different today than when I grew up there.
Yeah, unfortunately, being from Jersey, I'm not allowed to have any opinions on pizza when I discuss the topic with her, because she is convinced of a lot of hard stances given her geography, and I've learned not to pick that one up.
Good strategy.
Yeah, but let's talk a little bit more about AHP. You said that one of the big problems that companies run into is when ordering steel, they overestimate what they need.
Yeah.
How, and you started talking a little bit about how the company is trying to combat that. I'd love to hear a little bit more of that kind of innovation.
Sure. So if you think about steel plates, you've got 2 real important variables and then a couple of other subsidiary variables. First variable is the grade. You have main grades that work for steel. So you can have your workhorse, which is 836. You can have pressure vessel quality, 851670. You can have carbon grades like 1006, 1020, 1045. You can have light alloy grades like 4140, 4130, abrasion resistant plates, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you're a heavy plate service center, chances are you're going to carry at least 10 different grades. Some carry 20 or 25. And then you're going to stock in different thicknesses. Now, from 3-inch to 6-inch, you may stock in 1/4-inch increments of thickness. From there, you may stock in 1/2-inch increments up to, let's say, 12 inches. And then above 12 inches, you may stock 1-inch increments up to 16, 18, 20, 22-inch thick. When you multiply the number of grades by the number of thicknesses, you can come up with 400 to 450 SKUs. Each of those have their own demand requirements. So if somebody wants 12-inch plate, well, you can't make that out of 9-inch. You could machine 14-inch down to 12-inch, but then you've got a really big loss. So in terms of material value that you're just throwing in as scrap, machine scrap. So what most service centers do is they have to predict demand for 400, 500 different products. And you're doing it when you don't know what your value is going to be, your demand is going to be any given month or quarter. So we would look at, let's say, 16-inch A36 plate. And we would find that in some months we use 200 tons of it. And then you'd go 6 months without needing a pound of it. And then suddenly you needed 800 tons of it, and you needed it, within 3 or 4 weeks to meet the customer requirement. And that kind of crazy environment with those crazy spikes and very little predictability, service centers are caught short. Now, if you buy enough material to meet a certain level of demand for customers, chances are you're going to guess either too high or too low, and you're not going to meet the customer's demand and lose the order, or you're going to have too much exposure, too much working capital tied up in steel. And when the inevitable downturn comes in the economy, in the steel economy at the very least, you're going to face massive inventory write-downs. You're going to end up in violation of your bank covenants, and you're going to have a tough time surviving that downturn. And we found that over and over and over again with service centers throughout the industry.
Again, just as someone who's actively learning a lot more about the industry, when that, well, one, in your experience, do you think it's more often a problem of too much rather than too little? Just because it feels like naturally you would want to go overboard rather than not have enough product to accomplish the task at hand.
And that's why you would have a bright future in sales. Sales guys always want to have as much inventory to meet the customer demand as possible, and your finance people are screaming at you, what are you doing? It's too much steel, too much steel. And that is the eternal tension in the metals industry, having not enough versus having too much.
So what is when that surplus occurs, whether through accident or paranoia, what is the typical fate of that surplus? Like what is the typical protocol? What happens to it?
Let me take you back to 2008. Sales pricing at the beginning of the year was going up 4 or 5% a week. Quotes that would normally be given to customers for material that would normally be good for 2 or 3 weeks were suddenly good for a few hours. Material prices were surging weekly, monthly. There were shortages. There was scrambling for buying. And then November 3rd or November 4th, 2008, I'm calling my desk from my cell phone because I thought our phone system was down. My phone hadn't rang the entire morning. But what had happened is all of a sudden credit had seized up. All of these capital projects died. And suddenly steel was suddenly worth less. Now, it took a few months for the accounting to catch up to the losses that happened that day and over the next couple of weeks. But our company at that time lost half of its inventory over the course of the next few weeks, not because the steel went bad. These slabs will last, or plates will last for 50,000 years, but because suddenly they were worth that much less the next day. So the smart money, the folks who have been through this a bunch of times, they liquidate inventory, and they liquidate it very quickly. If I remember right, Metals USA liquidated, and then other service centers liquidated. So everyone engages in a fire sale until pretty much most people are out of inventory. Prices are now half of what they were, 40% of what they were. Everyone has burned through their capital lines of their banks. The banks have foreclosed on assets of some of the companies that couldn't quite survive. And then other companies are just basically selling material at a loss just in order to generate cash to keep their business going. And then they're going to sit at the bottom of that trough for a while, and then they're going to ride that next wave up. And everyone is always waiting for that next wave. And that's the cycle. Every 3 to 4 years it happens, and every 3 or 4 years people seem surprised by it happening. I just figured it'd be better to say, hey, let's accept the reality and let's figure out a better way to do it. So instead of you buying 5 pieces of 16-inch thick plate, 20 tons each, you have to buy 100 tons of it from a mill to get the order, plus a bunch of other stuff you're buying. If you have an order and you need 5 tons, I'll sell you 5 tons because I'm going to roll it the same week we deliver it to you. And I'll custom size it. So why buy a 96-inch wide by 240-inch long pattern size? That's what mills usually do, is they have you buy pattern size it. If you need 60 by 143, I'll roll you 60 by 143. And that way you're only buying what you need when you need it. You're eliminating your risk. And let's face it, at the end of the day, smart manufacturing companies have all moved that way. Intel moved that way decades ago with making silicon wafers. They used to buy warehouse loads of silicon wafers of a fixed size And then the designers would come along and design what they actually needed for computers that year. So they would stamp them out of these pre-existing wafers. They would throw away large amounts of this as pure waste, tying up cash the entire time. And then somebody at Intel was smart and said, why are we making these in advance of knowing what the designers are going to build this year? Why don't we wait? And somebody said, well, it's because it's the way we've always done it. That person hopefully lost their job, and somebody else came along and said, here's how we figure out how to do this. Here's how we match supply with demand instead of just trying to make really bad predictions about demand and figuring out how we're going to survive through what we get wrong.
Everyone in every industry is at some point trying to predict the future, whether through models, statistics. It's inevitable. And I think one of the best things about an industry like steel is you're dealing with a bedrock product. You're dealing with a substance that is integral to many aspects of life. And it's, from the production side, you don't have to worry about making too much or too little. You are making what is asked of you. Now, I think I would love to learn some more about what you think are the biggest issues on the production side of the steel plate industry in 2020. Like right now, is there any new challenges that you guys are having to face?
Well, COVID obviously is a challenge everyone worked with. In any given steel or basic materials industry, you're going to look at what your raw materials cost. You're going to look at what your products are selling at, and then that's your potential gap of how much money you can make. And from that, you subtract out your labor and your utilities and all the other costs that are required. And hopefully there's enough money in there to justify you having started a business. Well, what happened in the last 9 months in particular is that price spread between what you could sell it at and what you could buy it at compressed. It compressed to maybe half of its long-term historical norm. So instead of having, let's say, to make the math easier, normally you have a $300 a ton spread. Well, now you're spread $150. And if your costs are based on, let's say, $100 a ton, well, now you only have a $50 per ton spread, assuming everything goes well within your industry and prices don't dip any further. And anyone in steel this year has been living through that, every single company. Now the plate spreads compressed further. Hot roll has recorded, hot roll coil, cold roll coil, they've recovered a bit faster. And heavy plate's been delaying it, but you've got a lot of companies with a good amount of production selling into a market where it's just really impossible to make the sort of money that you need to make in order to be able to reinvest into your company and buy new equipment and invest in R&D on new products. And that's frankly the single biggest issue as a country that we've been dealing with is how do you make that work? How do you live through a low spread environment and come out the other side positioned for the inevitable bounce back in the market? It's funny, when I was pitching this project to private equity companies and investors, they would ask, well, what happens in a down market? Because steel is notoriously cyclical. I said, well, I can't tell you how bad it will be because every cycle exposes us to, sometimes the dips aren't so bad, sometimes the highs aren't so high. It just so happens we're a very low dip right now. But what I said is that I can tell you this, our model will work better than the legacy models in a downturn. Now, I wish I'd had a couple of years of running in a strong market before I had to prove the point. But in fact, I think our experience right now is proving that we've built that better mousetrap here. We have customers call and say, I need 14-inch plate. Okay, I'll roll it. And that's the big difference. We used to stock at a previous service center I worked with 52 thicknesses of A36. Today I stock 2 thicknesses of A36. I stock slab and I stock ingot. And then the ingot I get delivered in 1 week on a short-term basis whenever I need it. So I'm matching my cost to my sales price. And I can, from those 2 semi-finished products, make an infinite number of thicknesses up to the maximum width of our mill and the maximum length that we can handle. And that's the difference. My inventory is 1/3 to 1/4 of what it would be if I was stocking all those individual types of plate. So I've taken the risk, we've de-risked, or at least as much as we can.
Well, that definitely seems very reasonable, and I'm glad the private equity companies agreed, especially since they can be fairly cutthroat with this type of with any kind of innovation, just because it is a risk no matter how you slice it.
Yeah.
So you've experienced a very large amount of growth since inception. Everything is trending upwards
Mhm.
despite COVID, and your reactions as an organization to the outbreak have been very commendable. Where do you see this operation in 10 years?
Well, what we like to think is that we'll make 50 to 60,000 tons of plate a year. That will be perfect for a company of our size. We don't see ourselves growing to be a million ton a year mill. Nucor is building a very large plate mill that will come in line at the end of 2022. They will be a giant mass producer. We'll be like your corn bakery. If you want some marble rye or some challah bread, we're happy to take a special order, make it for you on demand. As compared to somebody else who runs a mass production line of, let's say, Wonder Bread, where if they tried to make a special order, that would mess their entire system. Where we see ourselves living is in that just-in-time sphere. People who need modest quantities of steel on a just-in-time basis. Maybe one of the best books I've read in the last 10 years was Longtail, talking about the future of American manufacturing. And they have a great illustration in the book of iTunes music demand. And obviously, you have Beyonce here in a curve. It's a very left-shifted curve. You've got people like Beyonce and Maroon 5 and other people are going to just get these monster demand. But then they began to look at that tail that runs out infinitely to the right-hand side. And it turns out that there's a couple hundred Fleetwood Macs streams, and Van Morrison is still getting some 4 or 5 listens a month. And it turns out if you take the size of that long tail and you turn that sort of vertically, it turns out it's a pretty big market. It may be as big as Beyonce if you have 1,000 other artists who all have a few streams. And essentially, that's the kind of future we're looking at in American manufacturing. We're not looking to sell 500,000 tons of plate. But if we could sell 50,000, 60,000 tons of plate to people who need it just in time with very specific quality requirements, and they want to buy what they want when they need it as compared to trying to guess months in advance of what they need, well, that's what we're here for.
I think your risk went with, just to compare and contrast that example reminded me a lot of the movie Moneyball. I don't know if you've seen it. Yeah, but the basic tenets are you could pay a lot of money for a star player or save a lot of money and recreate that player's statistics in the aggregate by getting other players that serve different needs and get on base about as much when put together. And I think that's a very interesting way to look at steel. Would you say that that the industry is shifting that way, or is this an innovation more in line with American heavy plates? Are you seeing it adopted by your competitors?
If you look at the industry right now, we're consolidation is the watchword here, and mass production. So Cleveland-Cliffs acquisition of the U.S. assets of ArcelorMittal, consolidation, new supply coming online from mills who are taking, let's say, the Section 232 bonus that they earned over a year and a half with higher steel prices. They're putting it into new capacity. So essentially, you're looking at, in the U.S. market, something very different. Most companies are going bigger, and there's definitely a place for that. It's just our ambitions were a bit more humble. We're happy not being the biggest mill out there, but we just want to be the most responsive and maybe have the best return on investment for our shareholders, not just the private equity guys, but also the community, and have a rock solid manufacturer in a community that's had nothing but job losses over the course of the last few years, and then be able to supply other American manufacturers. And that's the key. What's our purpose for being in existence? And that purpose is to be that rock solid supplier for the machine shops or the grind shops, for the small OEMs who don't need 300-ton minimum buys. They need a certain amount of steel when they need it to live in that long tail manufacturing environment. And that's really, I think, where American manufacturing 20 years out looks. It's not making 1 billion widgets or even 100 million widgets. It's making tailored products that fit the needs of the market at that particular time. And the product cycle turnover is much faster. Demand is not for 10,000 of something, it's for one of something very special that somebody will pay more of. And we see ourselves as serving as a very important, maybe an anchor supplier for companies who are engaging in that sort of just-in-time manufacturing.
we were discussing some of the ways that the waves that your company is reacting to trends, and how you've been seeing opposing companies react to similar trends, and do you think that there is going to be a universal standard that's adopted, and what kind of timeline do you think there is for that?
I think the world is far too interesting for there to be only one way to run a steel company. I look at what companies like Nucor do, and they are just fantastic at efficiency. They're fantastic at building plants and having them run really quickly. I look at Big River Steel, and I see what they've been able to do with de-risking their projects, and how fast they bring projects online, and the visionary way that they're doing things. So it'd be really boring. It'd be like thinking, wouldn't it be, is there only one way to run a rocket company? And I think right now we're blessed as a country, maybe as a world, to have lots of competing visions on how to build rockets and how to, take our civilization beyond the planet to places like Mars and the moon. And I think that way breeds lots of innovation. And I really do hope that there's room in the world for all sorts of models on how steel companies and other manufacturing companies can work.
I mean, in the abstract, I do definitely agree with that, that competition breeds a lot of innovation. Although with the rocket example, I can't imagine feeling great if I'm an astronaut being part of a rogue new take on rockets, with it being such a precarious industry as it is.
What was the great movie back in the 80s, and a book, The Right Stuff? And in fact, I hate to put it this way, but the death rate among test pilots was astronomical, something that we would not tolerate today. But at that era, going in the Cold War and then the space race, people were tolerant of a pretty risky environment for that. Not to say that with what's happening today with Elon Musk and those guys is anywhere close to that. In fact, so far they've got a fantastic safety record. Um, I think our concept of what acceptable risk is has changed, and I think in most ways it's changed for the better as a society.
Well, with the way risk is being readjusted and reassessed, steel, as an industry, would you say steel is still very much a traditional American institution, and how it's conducted and the way the businesses are run? Do you think it's slower to change maybe than some other businesses?
Oh, in terms of its pace of change, the answer is yes. There's a 10, 15, 20-year lag between what happens in some industries and progressive industries. Let's say microchips. It took Intel did for silicon chips. They did it 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Steel, we're doing it now for the first time. Generally speaking, aluminum is maybe a bit ahead of the curve on manufacturing, and steel is absolutely a laggard most of the time in technology. It is interesting to see AI being used now in some really impressive ways. The good news, though, I think, is that for companies who are willing to try new things, there's so much low-hanging fruit out there in the market in terms of technology. We can pick up technology that maybe costs billions of dollars to build in other industries, apply it to steel at a fraction of that cost, and reap outsized benefits because, frankly, most steel companies are pretty far behind in terms of technology. R&D gets a lot of investments at good companies. But, frankly, I don't think anyone's ever worked at a steel company and said, wow, we have an awesome ERP system. We are completely appified and ready to go. So no, I think there's lots of room for improvement, certainly in the domestic industry.
Well, I think this is a good place to end our conversation. It's been full of a lot of really fascinating information, and I think we definitely got a glimpse into how aspects of the industry are looking to change and become more efficient. And I would very much like to thank you for your time today, sir. Before we go, is there any this is a question that I should have gotten to a little bit earlier, but is there any new approaches or new technologies to specifically the plate industry that have gotten you very excited?
I think in terms of online portals, it sounds like such a basic thing, but the ability for people to interact directly with their customers and collect data. the ability for us to do real-time testing. I will say one that really excites me is what I see with Big River Steel. They integrated a product called Noodle AI. It's an artificial intelligence company, and they've taken on edge computing in some really interesting ways where they can monitor in real time a coil being rolled through their mill stands. And then if it's hitting the first stand and it's behaving in a certain way, and it hits the second stand, it's behaving a certain way. By the time it hits the third stand, they could have made adjustments in real time to change the force and the rest of the rolling process to achieve very specific targeted physical properties. That kind of technology sounds like science fiction to a lot of guys in the industry today, but they're making it work right now. And there are other companies jumping onto that particular bandwagon. So I do think we're looking at it ourselves. How do we incorporate AI in for being able to figure out optimizing nesting and optimizing plate size? How wide and how long do we make any given plate in order to ensure the most likely full use of it over the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks that it takes us to consume it? So I think AI is going to have a huge impact on the steel industry going forward. And frankly, it'll be unrecognizable to a lot of us old timers in a few years.
Well, not to bring up outside conversations again, but your reading material is pretty far reaching into the far future and distant past. So you might be a little bit more ahead of the curve on some things.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well, I appreciate you, sir. Thank you so much for your time. This has been another incredibly insightful episode of EOXS's Stories on Steel. Thanks again for Damian for stopping by. And remember, whether galvanized or hot rolled, EOXS will provide a marketplace to take any steel business to the online sector. Thank you and good night.